The streets of Earth had always been a place of routine. People rushing to their destinations, eyes cast downward, avoiding confrontation. For centuries, humanity had adhered to a set of unwritten rules: polite gestures, respectful tones, and controlled emotions. It was a system that had worked, or so it seemed. The council, watching from afar, saw it as a perfect order, an obedient species that could be controlled with ease. But what they did not know was that this politeness, this controlled behavior, was just a mask. Beneath the surface, humanity was beginning to tire. It began on an ordinary day, in an ordinary cafe, in the heart of a busy city. A man in his early 30s, dressed in a suit, accidentally bumped into a woman as he reached for his coffee. It was an honest mistake, a small misstep that in the past would have been met with a polite apology from both parties, a soft smile, and the situation would have ended there. But today was different. The woman, who had been quietly sipping her drink, suddenly stood up. Her face, normally composed, twisted with something the man hadn't expected: anger. The air in the cafe seemed to shift. Patrons looked up from their phones, shocked, as the woman yelled at the man. "Watch where you're going," she screamed, her voice sharp and cutting. The man, taken aback, opened his mouth to apologize, but something in her eyes stopped him. Instead, he felt a rising unease in his chest, a tension in the air that was spreading like wildfire. Other people in the cafe, witnesses to this exchange, seemed to feel it too. It was as if a collective switch had been flipped, and suddenly, no one wanted to be polite anymore. Across the room, a man, perhaps in his late 40s, stood up abruptly, slamming his fist on the table. "Who do you think you are, shouting like that?" His voice carried an edge, an anger that had been lying dormant for years, perhaps even decades. The scene grew more chaotic by the second. The cafe, once filled with the quiet hum of conversation and the clink of coffee cups, was now alive with shouts and heated words. Outside the cafe, the change was even more apparent. Pedestrians who had always kept to their own business, heads down, avoiding eye contact, were now arguing in the streets. Cars honked loudly, but it wasn't just the usual traffic noise. People were getting out of their vehicles, fists raised in anger, shouting at one another. Small groups formed on the sidewalks, arguing, debating, and throwing insults with no regard for the consequences. And the council, still observing, still thinking humanity was under their perfect control, could only watch in growing disbelief. This sudden eruption of anger was not isolated to just one city or one country. It spread across the globe like wildfire, faster than the council's surveillance systems could process. What had been a calm, polite world was quickly spiraling into chaos. It was as if every corner of Earth had decided, all at once, to reject the politeness they had been forced to display for so long. People were no longer afraid of what might happen if they spoke out or broke the rules. The floodgates had opened, and there was no going back. The council, who had long believed they controlled every aspect of human life, suddenly found themselves powerless. Their sophisticated algorithms had predicted this kind of behavior before, but never on such a massive scale. They had anticipated minor disruptions, small pockets of rebellion, but not this: a complete breakdown of the societal fabric in real time. The polite mask that humanity had worn for so long was gone, and now they were faced with something they had never imagined: the raw, unfiltered emotions of a species that had been forced to suppress its true nature for far too long. As the protests escalated, as cities burned and governments fell into disarray, the council scrambled to maintain control. They activated emergency protocols, sending in peacekeepers to quell the riots, deploying drones to monitor the situation, and trying to regain their grip on Earth's order. But it was too late. The anger was not something they could suppress with force or technology. It was something deep inside humanity, something that had been there all along, waiting for a reason to emerge. In one of the council's observation rooms, an officer watched the unfolding events on a large screen. His face was pale, his hands shaking. The data streams were flooding in too quickly, too chaotically. The polite behavior that had been so predictable was completely gone. Every individual seemed to be reacting in their own unique way, but all of them were responding with the same emotion: rage. This wasn't a temporary outburst. It was a systemic breakdown, a challenge to everything the council had built. The officer's mind raced. He quickly sent a message to the higher-ups, but the words felt hollow. He knew there was nothing they could do. It was as if the very fabric of human society had unraveled in an instant. This was no longer about quelling unrest. It was about survival. The council had underestimated humanity. They had thought their polite modes would keep the masses in check, but now they saw the true strength of human will, untamed and unstoppable. In every corner of Earth, the tide was turning. People were no longer afraid to speak their minds, no longer willing to accept the oppressive systems they had lived under for so long. And the council, for the first time, felt the weight of their mistake. As the chaos spread across the globe, an uneasy silence fell over the rebel factions that had quietly been forming for years. They had been waiting for this moment, the moment when humanity would finally break free from the chains of politeness, when they would rise up and take back control. Now, as the council's perfect order crumbled, they knew that their time had come. But they weren't the only ones ready for change. Humanity, as a whole, was awake, and nothing would stop them now. The council had watched the collapse of civility, but what they didn't know was that this was just the beginning. The next phase was one they could never predict, and one that would shatter everything they thought they knew about humanity. What had begun with a simple argument in a cafe had set the stage for the greatest upheaval Earth had ever seen. And the council, for all their power, were powerless to stop it. As the day unfolded, chaos spread across the globe faster than anyone could have anticipated. What had started as isolated outbursts of frustration turned into full-blown rebellions. Governments, police forces, and military units all scrambled to regain control, but the once subdued masses were no longer willing to submit. The polite mask that had kept them in line for so long had shattered, and now humanity was free to express anger, rage, and dissatisfaction in a way they never had before. From the crowded streets of New York to the quiet villages of rural China, humanity was showing its true face. People who had once quietly obeyed every order were now demanding answers, justice, and retribution. What was most shocking to the council was that this sudden rise of rebellion was not organized by any single faction. It wasn't a revolution planned by a group of radicals. It was everyone, from all walks of life, suddenly finding the courage to stand up and say, "No more." In the heart of the rebellion, at the center of this global storm, one story stood out. In the city of London, a woman named Clara had once been just another face in the crowd. She had lived her life in quiet compliance, keeping her head down, following the rules, and going about her business. But when the anger began to spread, something changed inside her. It started when she witnessed an argument at a local market, a disagreement that might have been a minor inconvenience in another time. But as the confrontation escalated, Clara felt something deep inside her stir. She had watched the same scenario play out 100 times before. People apologizing to one another, excusing each other's mistakes. But now, that old pattern was gone. The two people who were arguing weren't apologizing. They were screaming at each other, pushing one another, breaking everything in their path. For Clara, this wasn't just an incident at the market, it was a trigger. It awakened something inside her, a deep reservoir of frustration that had been buried for far too long. Without thinking, she stepped forward, grabbed a nearby megaphone, and shouted, "Enough." The crowd around her fell silent for a moment, but then something extraordinary happened. They listened. Clara's voice, once quiet and reserved, now resonated with a power she had never known. In that moment, Clara became more than just a woman in the crowd. She became a symbol of the rebellion, an unwilling leader in a world where no one was leading. And just like that, She was swept up in a new wave of change, leading protests, speaking out against the system, and calling for justice. But Clara wasn't alone. Across the globe, individuals just like her, ordinary people who had once been too polite, too controlled, were rising up. Social media, once a tool for connection, became a tool for revolution. Videos of protests, speeches, and calls for rebellion went viral, uniting people from every corner of the world. The world was waking up. The rebellion spread. In Paris, thousands gathered in front of the government's headquarters, demanding the resignation of their leaders. No one was holding back. No one was worried about keeping things civil anymore. The council's carefully constructed image of a peaceful, obedient humanity had been ripped away, and now the world was reacting. People who had lived in fear of losing their jobs, their status, or their safety were now marching in the streets, determined to take back their voices. The council, still observing from their faraway stations, were beginning to panic. This wasn't just a rebellion. They had underestimated how deeply the desire for freedom ran within humanity. They had assumed that humanity's politeness was an inherent trait, that they would always fall back into line. But they had failed to recognize the strength of the human spirit, a force that could not be controlled, a force that could not be suppressed indefinitely. The council's attempts to restore order were laughable. They sent in peacekeepers, but the soldiers were overwhelmed by the sheer number of rebellious citizens. They tried to broadcast calming messages, promising safety and resolution, but the people were beyond words. They no longer trusted the systems they had been forced to follow. The protests, now fully entrenched in every major city, were no longer about politeness. They were about something far more powerful: freedom, equality, and justice. The violence spread, but it wasn't the violence of rage alone. It was the violence of liberation. Ordinary people were storming government buildings, smashing the symbols of the council's control. Statues that had stood for centuries were toppled. Military bases were overrun. The very structures that had once seemed invincible were crumbling, and the council was helpless to stop it. The council's desperate measures. In the hidden chambers of the council's headquarters, panic had set in. Their carefully laid plans to manipulate humanity were failing, and the rebellion had become too widespread to contain. The council's leaders had always believed that they could control Earth through subtlety, through manipulation of emotions, through the control of information. They had created a world where humanity was convinced that politeness was the only way to survive, and they had been wrong. As the rebellions raged on, the council decided to take drastic action. They began activating their secret weapons, high-tech, mind-altering devices capable of manipulating human emotions. These devices were designed to restore control by suppressing anger, by forcing the population back into a state of compliance. But what the council did not realize was that their interference in the natural flow of human emotion only escalated the situation. These devices did not calm people down. Instead, they made humanity's anger even more intense. It was as if the very act of trying to control them only confirmed their deepest fears, that they were nothing more than puppets in a game controlled by the council. And so, the rebellion grew stronger. Clara, now a leader of one of the largest rebel factions in London, received word of the council's attempts to suppress the rebellion using technology. In an emergency meeting, she spoke to her fellow rebels. They think they can control us with their devices. But we are more than that. We are human, and we fight for our freedom, not their control. Her words were a rallying cry. The rebellion had moved beyond just throwing off the council's polite chains. Now, it was a fight for humanity's very soul. As Clara and her allies gathered to plan their next move, they knew one thing for sure. They had awakened something far greater than a simple rebellion. They had awakened the true power of humanity, the ability to break free from control and to fight for a future where their emotions, their actions, and their voices were their own. The chaos sweeping across the globe showed no signs of slowing down. What had started as small bursts of anger had escalated into full-scale uprisings, sweeping across cities, nations, and continents. Every corner of the world was affected. Governments were falling, military forces were being overrun, and society was fracturing in ways the Council never thought possible. The world, once obedient and polite, was now unrecognizable, a wild, untamed beast no one could control. In the high-tech control rooms of the Council's hidden headquarters, the panic was palpable. Council members, whose lives had been devoted to maintaining the illusion of a peaceful, compliant humanity, were now scrambling to understand what had gone so terribly wrong. "We need to restore order." Now, one of the senior officers demanded, pacing in front of a large holographic screen displaying the global chaos. The images flickered with footage of protesters storming government buildings, citizens tearing down the statues of the Council's symbols, and the streets filled with angry mobs. "This is our last chance," he continued, voice strained. "If we lose this war, everything we've worked for is over." A desperate plan. The Council had already tried conventional tactics, sending peacekeepers, issuing stern messages, and even launching targeted strikes at key rebel locations. But these actions had only made the situation worse. Every move they made seemed to stoke the flames of rebellion. It was as if humanity was rejecting everything the Council stood for, all at once. Now, with their back against the wall, the Council was forced to turn to a more drastic measure, a weapon of unimaginable power. They had been working on it for years in secret, a device capable of controlling the minds of millions. This device, once activated, would impose an artificial state of calm on Earth's population, forcibly restoring humanity's polite mode. It was a kind of mental subjugation, a mass control system that would erase the anger, the rebellion, and restore the status quo. They believed it would be their salvation, their final answer to bringing the world back under control. But there was something the Council didn't know, something that had never crossed their minds. The device was not foolproof. There was always a chance that it would backfire. The device's activation. The Council's highest-ranking officials, in a state of fear and desperation, ordered the activation of the device. It was launched in a series of global broadcasts, transmitted across every television, radio, and digital screen around the world. A message went out to every device connected to the global network. Stay calm. Obey. Return to normalcy. The Council will restore order. At first, nothing seemed to happen. People went about their daily lives, oblivious to the message, or perhaps dismissing it as just another failed attempt by the powers that be. But then, the true effect began to set in. The device malfunctions. The device, designed to suppress anger and force compliance, did the exact opposite. Instead of calming the masses, it amplified their anger. The thoughts, the deep-seated frustrations that had been bubbling under the surface of humanity for centuries, surged to the forefront. Every person who received the signal felt their irritation, their rage, and their resistance grow stronger. They had been given the impulse to obey, yes, but not in the way the Council intended. A young man in Rio de Janeiro, who had been protesting the government for weeks, suddenly felt a burning wave of fury wash over him. He wasn't calmer. He was angrier than ever before. The device had tapped into something primal, a deep need for freedom, and it triggered a surge of defiance that spread through the streets like wildfire. People who had been content to stay home, unsure about the protests, suddenly found themselves on the front lines, screaming at the system, tearing down the barriers. Global rebellion intensifies. In New Delhi, the same reaction occurred. People who had been content to sit silently in their homes for fear of retribution suddenly found themselves marching through the streets, demanding their voices be heard. Governments tried to regain control by deploying military forces, but the moment they arrived, they were met not with quiet submission but with an overwhelming, unstoppable tide of angry civilians. It wasn't just rebellion. It was rage that had been building for years, a rage that no mind control device could contain. In Paris, The message from the council was interrupted by a hacker's broadcast, a group of rebels who had gained access to the system. Instead of the council's calming message, the world saw a new transmission. We will not comply. Humanity is not yours to control. The council's device had completely backfired. Rather than taming humanity, it had united them in defiance. The more the council tried to push humanity back into submission, the more they fought back, armed not with weapons, but with the power of collective anger and desire for freedom. The council's realization. Back in the council's headquarters, the results were devastating. The device was designed to make people docile, obedient, yet it had done the exact opposite. Humans had become more vocal, more resistant, and more united in their rebellion. What happened? A senior official asked, staring at the screens. This wasn't supposed to happen. It should have calmed them down. The reality was far worse than they had imagined. The rebellion had grown too powerful, too widespread. It was no longer something they could contain with technology or force. What they were dealing with was not just a rebellion. It was a shift in the very fabric of humanity. The politeness, the order they had enforced for so long, was not just gone. It had been shattered irreparably. The council knew, deep down, that they had underestimated humanity. They had thought that humanity's behavior was a product of control, but they had overlooked one key fact. Humanity's politeness was not true obedience. It was a social construct, a surface-level politeness, maintained only by fear and surveillance. The moment that fear was lifted, the true nature of humanity, wild, untamed, and free, had been unleashed. A last-ditch effort. In their desperation, the council decided to unleash their final weapon, a massive, global strike. They planned to use their last remaining forces, their most advanced weaponry, to quell the rebellion once and for all. They were willing to sacrifice everything, their global network, their reputation, even Earth itself, if it meant they could regain control. But as they prepared for the final strike, one question hung in the air. Would humanity submit, or would the council face their own destruction at the hands of the very species they thought they had mastered? The globe was a battlefield. From every corner of Earth, the fires of rebellion were burning hotter than ever. Governments had fallen, and nations had splintered into factions. The council, once an invisible force controlling the flow of humanity's existence, now faced a world they could no longer dominate. Their once powerful devices had backfired, their global network fractured, and the people, unified by years of suppression, were no longer afraid. They were free. But the council wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The final weapon. Deep beneath the earth, in a hidden command center, the final weapon was being prepared. The council's last chance at regaining control was a powerful satellite-based system, capable of launching devastating electromagnetic pulses, EMPs, that would disable every piece of technology on the planet. The idea was simple: shut down all communications, disrupt global infrastructure, and bring the planet to a standstill. Humanity would be thrown back into the Dark Ages, their rebellions erased in an instant. It was a brutal, desperate plan, but the council believed they had no other option. They could not allow their vision of the world to collapse. As the countdown to launch began, a wave of fear washed over the higher-ups in the council. They had always believed in their control, always trusted that humanity would fall in line when faced with the threat of annihilation. But now, for the first time, doubt crept in. They could feel the pressure of the rebellion building, and the longer they waited, the more intense the resistance became. Every second they delayed, the flames of revolution grew stronger. The heart of the rebellion. On the streets, Clara and her allies were preparing for the final confrontation. After weeks of protests, riots, and guerrilla warfare, the rebels had gathered in the heart of the city. With every passing day, more and more people joined the cause. Ordinary citizens, who had once been content to sit back and accept the status quo, had now taken up arms, fighting for the future of humanity. Their message was simple: freedom, Clara stood before the gathering crowd, her voice carrying over the chaos. We are not just fighting for ourselves. We are fighting for every person who was silenced, for every child who was told they didn't matter, for every man and woman who was forced to hide their anger in the name of politeness. This is our moment. We will not go back to being the puppets of the council. The crowd erupted in cheers. Clara's words were not just motivational. They were a call to arms. They had all felt the sting of suppression, the weight of their voices being stifled for years. But now, as they stood together, they knew one thing for certain. They would not be silenced anymore. The council's strike. With the final weapon ready, the council gave the order. The countdown reached 0, and the EMP was activated. Across the globe, the lights flickered and died. Cities were plunged into darkness. The digital world, the lifeblood of modern society, disappeared in an instant. Phones, televisions, computers, satellites, all became useless. The global blackout was instantaneous, and the people who had been so reliant on technology were left to face the harsh reality of their existence. The streets went quiet as the hum of civilization was erased in the blink of an eye. But the council underestimated one crucial detail. The people were already beyond their reach. Humanity's response. In the hours after the EMP strike, humanity did not collapse as the council had hoped. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The blackout, though a devastating blow, became the spark that ignited an even greater resistance. The rebels, who had already taken to the streets with little more than their wits and their passion, were now operating in a world without the chains of technology. For the first time in years, humanity was freed from the surveillance, free from the constant monitoring. They didn't need technology to communicate. They had their voices, their fists, and their will to fight. And fight they did. In the darkened streets, people organized in ways that were once impossible. Old-fashioned radio broadcasts, written pamphlets, and word of mouth became the rallying cry. Rebels set up barricades, repurposed abandoned vehicles, and fortified buildings. Cities that had once been the heart of civilization were now battlegrounds where every corner was claimed by those who refused to go back to the old ways. Even the council's final weapon, the EMP, had a limited effect. While it destroyed much of the infrastructure, it also exposed the vulnerability of the very system they had relied on to maintain control. The collapse of their global network forced the council to reveal their true weakness. They had never truly understood the spirit of humanity. The final confrontation. As the resistance gathered strength, Clara's faction moved to strike at the heart of the council's operations. With every passing day, the stakes grew higher. The remaining pockets of the council's forces were now on the defensive. The people, united in their cause, stormed the council's hidden bases, tearing down their walls and reclaiming their cities. The final battle took place in the ruins of a once thriving metropolis, a symbolic location, the very heart of the council's power. Clara led the charge, her heart beating with a mix of fear and determination. The streets were filled with the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and battle cries as the council's forces scrambled to protect the final remnants of their empire. But the council was outnumbered, outmatched, and outgunned. The people had won the psychological war long ago. They had united in a way the council could never have predicted. And now, they were fighting not just for their survival, but for a new world, a world where they could finally live freely, without fear of being controlled. As Clara and her comrades breached the council's final stronghold, they found the remaining leaders in their control rooms, cowering in fear. They had no plan left. Their final weapon had failed, their global infrastructure had crumbled, and their empire was no more. With a look of defiance, Clara stood before the remnants of the council's leaders. "You thought you could control us. You thought we were weak," she said, her voice echoing through the broken halls. "But now you see, we are humanity, and we will not be controlled." The council's collapse. The council's reign, which had spanned centuries, came to an abrupt end that day. The leaders were taken into custody, the remaining control centers were dismantled, and the world began to rebuild. The people of Earth, no longer bound by fear or compliance, began to forge a new path, one built on freedom, equality, and respect for the natural chaos that was human emotion. The final battle was over, and as the dust settled, Clara and the rebels stood together, victorious. Humanity had broken free from the chains of politeness, and they had learned something powerful. Their true strength lay not in their ability to follow orders, but in their courage to rise, to fight, and to embrace their true selves.